We all know how imperfect our bodies are because we live and use them every single day. So most of us have chronic lower back issues as we get older. We have knees that are weak and vulnerable. One of the more interesting is our throats. One throat leads to two passages, one to the lungs and one to the stomach, which makes us very vulnerable to choking, especially because, unlike any other animal, we use our tongue and lips for talking, often at the same time as we're speaking, which aggravates that condition and makes us even more vulnerable to choking. So there are a whole host of what I call design flaws with our bodies, but there's also a whole other category of imperfections that I call environmental mismatch issues. So that is design that worked very well in one environment in the past that doesn't work as well today. And one of the more obvious examples of that is our craving for sugar. So once upon a time, an almost insatiable craving for sugar, and for that matter, salt, was very motivational to get us to eat fruit and protein. But today, we're faced with an overabundance of sugary, fatty, simple carbs, which is not so good for our nutrition, obviously, and not so good for our weight. And that represents a problem in terms of today's environment versus the previous one. The other problem is that we have created, through technology, very soft, easily digestible food, which means we can scarf it down really, really quickly before a feeling of fullness is triggered. So that's another problem in terms of environmental mismatch, that the triggers in our own body to indicate to us that we're full come too late in the game because we're not used to having adapted to this easily digestible food that we can whip down our gullet so quickly. But for these environmental mismatches, we have become adept at taking corrective action. So many of us go to the gym or have gym memberships, we diet, we get educated and watch what we eat. Here's the point I want to make. Our brains operate just as imperfectly as the rest of us. As amazing as our brains are, they are by far anything but perfect. And we need to take corrective action to deal with their imperfections, in particular, the environmental mismatch issues that arise in how we think relative to the new world that we're living in, with complex problems that our ancestors didn't have to face. So, for instance, it was just a couple hundred years ago, the vast majority of us, nearly 90% of us, lived on farming communities. And most of us living in those farming communities were farmers. And that's not to say that the problems weren't difficult, the environment wasn't harsh, but the cues we needed to make sense of our world, the social complexity, the raising of crops, the raising of animals, they were more straightforward. The cues we needed were more obvious, and our ability to manage those problems was a little more straightforward than the complexity we're faced with today, such as living in densely populated urban environments where there is significant income disparity between the rich and the poor, the challenge of raising well-adjusted children in a social media environment that didn't exist up until a decade ago, creating meaning in our lives, developing careers that are satisfying and meaningful for us. These are all challenges, never mind global warming and terrorism, challenges that many of our ancestors, for generations upon generations upon generations, did not have to cope with. And therefore, there's an environmental mismatch between what the world is creating for us in complexity and how we think about it. And therefore, we have to take corrective action, much as we do by going to the gym and watching our diet. We have to take corrective action in how we think so we can apply more sophisticated strategies to those problems. Now, I'll get into more detail about the strategies that we need to take specifically, but the point I want to emphasize is that while we're very attuned to and aware of our body imperfections, we're not nearly as aware as we need to be about our mental imperfections. And that gets us into trouble, but it also presents an opportunity for us to really get smarter and handle complex problems much more intelligently.